I'm Isabella and you're listening to Zeno. Each month I have conversations with people from all walks of life about their personal stories of home, identity and the search for belonging. Anthony Anaxagorou, thank you so much for coming onto the show. I feel like there's a million and one things that you could go into with your wonderful book, Heritage Aesthetics. How do you answer the question, where are you from, and what truths are missing from the answer that you give?
What truths? I've always found it an interesting question because I think on the first instance, you kind of assess who's asking. And I think it's partly related to geography. I think it's partly related to the person doing the asking. For instance, if you're in Thailand as someone who's from Europe or grew up in Europe or whatever, and you see someone else who is, say, from London, the where you're from becomes a different question. Whereas if you are born in, say, somewhere like London, like myself, and I'm not English, but I'm British, and somebody asks you where you're from, there's two parts to the question. So it's how do you navigate those elements and, like you say, answer truthfully. And you two things can be true at the same time. I can be British, but I could also be a Cypriot. I think where it gets contentious is where the question becomes loaded, in that the person asking is trying to other you in some kind of way. Oh, it's obvious you're not from here. Why are you here? And where are you really from? And the really part being, this is an inauthentic space that your body is in. People like you shouldn't be here. And those are the connotations that come with the more pernicious line of questioning. So how I answer it is I say my parents were born in Cyprus, I was born in London, so I'm of Cypriot origin, but I'm British, if we get into that. And then, obviously, usually someone swears at you in your own language. There's a way of trying to build connections.
Yeah, any kind of TV, film reference back at you. You make a clear distinction between being English and British. To make that distinction as British rather than English is very interesting.
Yeah, I think partly because English is a race. Yeah, Scottish is a race, and these are racial groups as we know them. So to say that, but whereas British is a nationality, and the same American is a nationality. The original Americans, we know who they are and how they've been treated. So I feel it's a question of nationality versus race.
You open the book, Heritage Aesthetics, with this quote from Didier Eribon. Absolutely wonderful way to be situated in the collection. The quote you reference, the processes by which you come to belong to yourself or to transform yourself, to constitute an identity or to refuse an identity, were thus always tightly linked for me, imbricated each one in the other, fighting with each other, holding each other in check. And that quote, as well as Didier's work, helped me reflect on the idea that the identities we choose are a political act. And you've said previously that Cypriot identity is wholly political. And I'd love to know, what process of transformation have you undergone by writing Heritage Aesthetics?
Yeah, that's a good question. When we say wholly political, I think all identities are wholly political. But I think with the Cypriot one, obviously it's the closest one to me. But I think with the Didier Eribon idea, it's that there is a bifurcation there that I'm really interested in. There's a binary tension between two things, between having an identity that you choose and having an identity that has been put on you. The Heritage Aesthetic project, and I think perhaps the project after the Formalities, the book that came before this, was really interested in how we can be racialized, how we can be brought up in a country where we hit kind of a racial puberty and those early ideas of who we are come from outside us. And we accept them. If you think about 12, 13, when you start to become aware of your body and your body in a public space, how you're perceived versus who you are. So your interiority versus your exteriority. And I think Heritage Aesthetics for me was more of a personal quest. After the Formalities, felt that it was kind of looking at family in perhaps quite a loose way. Whereas I think with this one, the ideas, the questions that I took to the project were tightly linked to the idea of how we constitute a dual self, a self that is, to use Webb Du Bois's, that double consciousness, which I feel anyone who is living in a diaspora will understand, that you're essentially wrestling with two sets of identities, which is why, again, identity being singular is an interesting construction. I've always thought of, same with masculinity, people refer to masculinities as plural, as there's many different kinds. And I kind of feel that with the Cypriot idea, I can't talk on behalf of other Cypriots and how they see themselves and how they move through the world, but I can talk about my experiences and how they've shaped the way that I feel my Cypriotness is related to things outside of that. With this project, it was really about taking questions and not necessarily solving them. I don't think the function of art in general is a solution-based one. I've said this before, but I think it's about offering complication to where we see things as being quite straightforward. I think one of the main virtues and strengths of art is that it has the ability to complicate what is already quite familiar. And through that complication, you create new systems of thought, of feeling, and of consciousness, which I kind of think is what I'm grappling with in that book. I haven't got an answer. I've just got a set of problems that live within the atmosphere of a poem.
There's so much that you can dive into just there. You bring up the idea of dualities, and I think that's even more uniquely felt for those in the Cypriot diaspora, because the island has been separated into two parts. And you've spoken as well about your family and how different members of your family, your grandparents on both sides, had very different perspectives on what it meant to be Cypriot. And it's wonderful and inspiring to see you particularize that through heritage aesthetics. I'd love for you to read one. I'd love you to read We Are Us Now.
We are us now. Sergeant Clerk is the Acorn's clerk, but is prone to get in rages. If the wogs give any trouble, he puts them into cages. The Grenada Magazine, published in British Cyprus, 1958. Boy at the back, why have you come here the wrong way round? And why do you struggle to tell the group how many of the tribe you've brought along with you? I love this country, I do, but its yesterday is far the terrifying. We swapped the cage for a cage as you do. Both grandparents splitting mops and bruised plums, Christmas 88. That was my family, living with the family from next door. The kids by the barbed wire fence playing with prayers they couldn't use, dressing me in a flag that was unlike mine. God grew into a secret way of admitting trouble. Each Remembrance Sunday, I knelt in a field behind the house where only twigs found it in them to bend. A shot rabbit running from what I couldn't see. Most of life happens behind us, or has happened in a different colour. The TV in our kitchen lost its mind at my mother's immigrant face, despite her best shepherd's pie. My father, his briefcase made of genuine leather, said, "Boy, wherever you stand, make sure you can be seen and don't move. Don't say another fucking thing."
Thank you. What were your earliest memories of feeling like an outsider or like you didn't belong?
It's interesting because I always felt like I did actually belong, but I was just kind of tried to be talked out of it when I was at school. And it was the white kids. It was the white kids. It was the English kids. It was the kids who kind of used to say, and I remember it began around the age of 11, 12, and I have a distinct memory of being in the playground and I was just getting into like American hip hop and I started rapping something. It might have been a Tupac lyric, I don't know what it was, but I was rapping something in the playground and one of the kids said, "Oh, the only reason you can do that is because you're not white." And I was like, "What? Oh, white? What does that mean?" And then my friend Paul Uagbo, who was Nigerian, said, "He is white." And the English kid was like, "No, he's not. He's a foreigner." And we were 11. And then I remember being pretty confused. And I remember going home. And then I said to my dad around the table, like, "What are we?" And he said, "What do you mean, what are we?" I said, "Well, what are we? Some kid today said that I wasn't white." And he was like, "Of course you're white. Where else are you black?" And then I was like, no, but I don't think I am white and I don't think I am black. Is there an in-between? And he was like, what, you Indian? And I said, no, but there has to be another. But he said, that's it. You've got no other choices. So I was like, okay, cool. And then as I got older, I began to see certain, I guess, cultural characteristics, certain groups say, you guys you're not white. But we weren't even Greek, although Greek became a shorthand for Cypriot. And even Turkish Cypriots would say they're Turkish, and Greek Cypriots would say they're Greek. There was an erasure of the Cypriot identity and this kind of like absorption into these two kind of homogenous nationalities, being Greek and Turkish, although neither of us, Turkish Cypriots, Greek Cypriots, are from those countries. But it just became an easy way to talk about who we were. And then I just grew up very confused. My brother, who is considerably darker than me, was always thought of as being either mixed race or Moroccan. But my mum's dark, my dad's fair. And so he used to be like, he was beaten up. He was attacked. He was beaten by police. He was with 3 black kids, and all 4 of them were put into a van, and they were assaulted by police for no reason aside from the fact that they were just getting in their car at like 2 a.m. in Coventry after a night out. And there was a load of stuff that happened that just made me think, if we were white, where's whiteness now? Why are we being assaulted? Why am I hearing stories from my uncles? They were called the P word when they moved into a very white area. They had big bricks thrown through their window. My mum was nearly raped when she was 18. Well, they tried to, but they didn't do it. Both my parents were attacked by skinheads in the late 60s. So the question I used to have is, if we are not white, then why has all this happened? And then my dad would say it's xenophobia. And I was like, this is interesting, xeno, to be foreign. But I was like, but how do they know we're foreign? And what's the difference between xenophobia and racism? And my friends were all from different countries. None of my friends were white English. They were all from other places. But I felt with the Turkish kids, with the Iranian kids, and with the Middle Eastern kids, we had a shared malaise. No one was really sure, because Iranians, some people saw them as white and some people didn't. And they themselves saw themselves as white. But because they didn't talk Arabic, they spoke Farsi. And same with Turkish folk. Half the countries in Europe, half is in Asia Minor. So it was just very complicated, that part of the world. But then you had colorism and passing. If you looked like you weren't white, then you weren't white, even if you were Sicilian. And it just became very complex. And the more I looked into it, the more I realised there wasn't a straight answer. And people that come from countries that have been very heavily colonised, and their genome is made up of many different groups, then there is no archetypal way of looking at, that's what a quintessential Cypriot looks like. Because we could look like anything from English, white, blonde hair, blue eyes, ginger, all the way through to more or less afro hair and very dark skin and broad features. So the physiognomy wasn't an indicator. And I think that's what used to confuse me, was that I had no clear way of demarcating who we were, other than the fact that we just didn't look English. Like, where are you from? Racially ambiguous was a term that was always thrown around.
Yeah, that helpful term.
Yeah.
It's incredible because you've so deeply invested yourself in the literature across different areas of these identities, and it's an amazing thing to be able to inhabit that experience with you in heritage aesthetics. I mean, I don't share that identity at all, and I felt extremely seen in terms of all these strands of inquiry, whether it's anthropology or psychology, and like breaking all these things down, even notions of the family and the family as an agent of the state, and like all of these things and how they come together. Also, having grown up in London, it's like the diaspora community from Cyprus, and then everybody, you have quote Turkish Cypriots and quote Greek Cypriots living in the same neighbourhoods.
Yeah. You couldn't tell the difference. You could drive past the family and think it's the same thing. And part of when the British got there in 1878, they also didn't know who was who. There was a religious difference in that they were Muslim and the Greek Cypriots were Christian. But as opposed to like the English, you all just looked the same to us. So it's really interesting that you've picked up on those things, because I think part of my intention with the book was to go deeper into, rather than just saying the British were bad, which we all know, and colonialism was horrible, and some people, are we in a post-colonial phase, or is there still an existential kind of residue left over from British colonialism? The book was more looking at intergenerational traumas, transatlantic traumas, looking at epigenetics, the psychology of having a condition that comes through generations. So I really try to use the image, use sound, use kind of non sequitur modes of writing to almost chart the choreography of an anxious mind, of a mind that is essentially traumatized in some capacity and is living in an active trauma state.
I felt that very much so in the writing, and even the way that certain phrases in separate poems just kind of sit with you, like a violence so exact it sanitizes history. Like that sat with me for probably 2 weeks. And I think, what other types of violence have sought to sanitize me? And that just took me a whole other rabbit hole. You touched on colonialism, and that's a massive theme in the book. We're at a very strange time, the King's coronation. And you're questioning, are we living in a post-colonial society, or are we still experiencing the remnants of that nostalgia and harking back, iconoclast consciousness? So if it even is that, what are you reflecting on at this time, given tomorrow's the King's coronation?
I mean, I could not give two monkeys about the coronation or the royal family. I'm interested in what symbolically the royal family represent. They're just people. Like they were born into those positions, they were born into wealth and whatever it is, and they're all fucked up, as we all see. So I'm not really interested in them as individuals. I'm interested in what they represent to, I guess, the British imagination, and how they represent nationalism, sovereignty, empire, like all these motifs that people need in order to build their own sense of identity, this jingoism that you kind of see when the bunting comes out. Oh, we're proud to be British. But what is British about these people? I don't understand. And so we create these kind of like networks around the way that they talk, or opulence, and this idea of elitism, and all that feeds into essentially the class system, the hierarchies that we perpetuate, and they are the reason why we have them. And so people that are anti-class or doing activism, yet are also monarchists and royalists, I don't understand. Even people that accept MBEs and whatever else, if your work in art is around empire, is around class, is around race, is around systems of division, inequality, yet you accept something from an institution that is essentially pioneered the inequalities that we have, sustains them. It's the bastion. It's a complete contrast, and it's not a kind of wokiness. It's just the logic. It's like you can't go to the house that keeps you underfed, malnourished, poor and deprived, and in the moment they say to you, come in and have a seat, you just, okay, cool, and then you leave and all your principles go. So I kind of just feel that it is a matter of integrity. And for me, the royal family are symbolic of a symptom, a deep, you say, nostalgia that forms English consciousness. And I think there's a lot of English people that don't subscribe to the idea of the royal family as well, which is fine. But for me, it's the symbol. And when the Queen died, what exactly were we mourning? No one knew the Queen. She was a very quiet, private, conservative woman. And maybe she was a blank canvas for people to project whatever they wanted onto, of what their idea of Englishness was. And when she died, part of that image that they'd created through her reticence is what they were mourning. Mm. So they're mourning themselves because no one knew who she was. I heard her speak about 6 times in my 40 years of living here.
Absolutely. I mean, it was an opportunity to really reflect and dig deep into British identity, and there's a chance to reinvent that. Wonderful artists and academics, and especially diaspora communities, are already doing that. As you say, it's a reflection of their lost sense of identity. I mean, there was like a talk show on YouTube, I can't even remember what it was called, but they gathered like I think Dr. Scholar was in it, anti-royals versus die-hard royalists. But one of the royalists by the end of the debate just said, when the pomp is all gone, there's nothing left. We don't have anything left. It's like realising that that is all that props up that identity is the status, and thinking that they can associate themselves with that level of status.
Yeah, I mean, and it's the most for people who go on about the democracy, to have an unelected family just sit at the helm who are worth 20, 30 billion, and they've done nothing aside from wave and cause a load of problems. I don't understand. But people, when I've voiced this stuff before, oh, he's got an axe to grind, these are artists, these are lefties, are this, he's that. I just look at the logic, really. Like, and perhaps maybe I do have a little axe to grind, but it's not a big old Viking axe. This is a small axe. And I feel that the logic for me, when it comes to democracy, the class system, elitism, inheritance, this is what I find quite perverse. And that's what I want to challenge, because no one put them there. Same with House of Lords. Like, who put those guys there? So I think that there's a logic in here that feels quite corrupt. And that really is what I think I challenge. I don't know them. They're probably all right people if you sit down and have a drink with them, and they've all got their problems that everyone seems to be interested in. But it is that, right? Like it's fandom. And fandom, there's no room for criticism when it comes to that, because really what people are doing is they're projecting, or they're protecting even, an image of themselves that has been allowed to manifest through this canvas that people, same with the cult of celebrity, it's the same thing, because people see themselves in those figures. So when you critique or chastise a particular figure, you're critiquing that individual. They have an emotional attachment to it, and that's why rationality doesn't even come into it.
I really resonate with that association with them as being just part of the cult of celebrity. The parade, the diamonds and the rubies and the crown and all of that, it adds to that aura of celebrity.
Yeah.
And it just feels like they're really grasping as tight as they can onto it. But actually polls suggest that very few people actually care. And you used a perfect word, like malnourished. Like, we are being spiritually malnourished by this institution that continues on.
Yeah. And I think it's a wider cultural thing. We have so much media illiteracy when it comes to how we read the news, what we choose to subscribe to, what we choose to believe, shape our lives around and our beliefs. But as you say, like, I think it just feels like a big waste of money, where you've got so many problems in this country. That money just could be used elsewhere for the better good, rather than taxpayers' money's coming out for this guy to just stick a crown on his head. And then what? It just feels medieval. Like, it just feels so like Dungeons and Dragons, like King Charles III. Like, come on, man.
One of the ways that you've spoken about heritage aesthetics is about you want to make poems that carry a question, and that art should be something that you really engage with and inhabit, rather than it being something palatable or easily digestible. And that got me really thinking about Byung-Chul Han's psychopolitics, and how he argues that we've moved away from the Foucault disciplinary society, which is that people have to be disciplined in order to act, whereas now we're in an entrepreneurial information technology society where we're being encouraged to just consume and create for consumption.
For the mass market.
For the mass market, exactly. And I'd love to know, why was it important for you to particularize the complexity of Cypriot identity?
I think part of the battle within colonial discourse and colonial theory is autonomy. And for me, to have a poetry that invited the reader in, that was ambiguous in parts, opaque in parts, confusing, contradictory, but also what I hope to be immersive, was essentially what I think a lot of people who live in the diaspora are striving for, a sense of autonomy. And I wanted to try and give the reader autonomy. And obviously the reader makes meaning from a text. The text is useless, right? On its own, it does nothing. Once it engages a reader's imagination, the reader then completes the circuit. And I kind of feel that the for me, it was really about trying to have a poetry that invited people in, but maybe did confuse them, maybe did make them scratch their heads, maybe I want to go back in, because that's what I've been doing my whole life. I don't have the answer, and I think if I had an answer, it would be a more didactic, more rhetorical project with less room for a reader, and the reader just either agreeing or disagreeing with wherever I landed. But it's not adversarial, it's not polemic, it's an immersive experience that I work around the psychology of a feeling. And sometimes that feeling is anger, frustration, confusion, all of those things in one. How do you create an infrastructure within a poem that allows for those emotions to coexist, but also allows the reader to inhabit those emotions and render them in their own way? And that really is what I was trying to do. I've never tried to say anything directly in a poem, not in the last 6-7 years anyway. When I was spoken word, I think that the mission of a spoken word poem is very different. But I think when I started to work around big questions and not necessarily try to resolve or answer anything or make a point even, but create a colour. How do you make a colour from 15 different colours? I mean, it's a pretty abstract answer, but that's the closest I can get to like the way that I approach these things. I begin with uncertainty.
Yeah, and it's an experience that, as someone who's been othered, it's something that you experience often.
Yeah, and maybe the reader feels locked out because they're like, well, I don't get this. Then maybe you're asking the wrong question. I don't particularly write things to be got. I write things to be felt, to be thought, to bamboozle, confide, edify, stupefy, like whatever it is. But not to be got, because I don't get it. I don't get a lot of things. I don't get why we're going to wave at this king guy tomorrow. I don't get it. I mean, I get it in an intellectual sense, but then there's a spiritual element, there's an emotional element that I don't understand. And I think that's where poetry and the lyric comes into its own.
And that's one of the many wonderful things about the book as well, is this fully embodied sense of interiority. And over the last year, I've been using writing to develop that inner world and that like sense of interiority, and seeing how you've explored that has been very inspiring, because when you are someone who's othered in society, or you come up against a lot of conflicts, and if you think about the conflict in Cyprus and the schisms of identities and all these different things, it's so much of society robs you of that interior life and that sense of interiority.
Well, it's the idea of the performative self, isn't it? It's the idea you have to present a best self to the world, to the public. And a lot of the time our interiorities are so vast and they're knotty and they're noisy and they're chaotic, and we just have to somehow iron out everything on a Monday morning and present this. So I think art allows for that metabolization of the interiority, of the self that isn't sure. We talk in absolutes. Everyone is sure of everything these days. Like Twitter is absolute central. Like everyone talks in certainty. So where do we go to be vulnerable? Outside of therapy speak, how can we create a new language where, again, like the idea of care is a whole different discussion, and transgression is a whole different discussion. But how do we take that interiority in all its guises and facets and dimensions and find a language that meets it?
In that way, the language is very radical. And I loved how you employed language in the book and looking at anthropological writings from colonialists and upended them and faced them back towards us. What languages have you found home in?
The poetic language. The thing is, you've got language in a literal sense, but then you've got the language of music, you've got the language of painting, the language of the image. You read into everything. Reading text is a very small part of actually language and communication. I mean, everything in this room is communicating to me right now, from the plant to the mics to everything is saying something. And I feel that for me, one of the real blessings of being an artist. It's the ability to pay attention and to notice. And I think that's what artists do. And people misconstrue sensitivity. I think, yeah, sure, we're sensitive people. A lot of poets are empaths, artists are empaths, they feel, but they're involved in a cultural empathy, an empathy that's built around the lives of people and the interpersonal, and how those lives play out when they are put up against each other. And that's really what I think the job of art, part is sociology and part is paying attention and noticing. And the two intertwine. And those are the languages that I'm interested in. For me, I work in, like, my toolkit is the English language, although it's not my language. I couldn't speak it till I was 6. But it's the language that I work in. It's the language that I feel, it's like getting in a car and taking a big ride out and there's no one around. That's kind of what it feels. There's a freedom that comes from, I think, taking a word that we all know and turning it upside down.
I spoke with Cypriot Dhaliwal, who's also a poet and a writer, and she often quotes this author who says that poetry is my mother tongue. And there's something very empowering about using the English language as a tool, which was also used as a tool to oppress Cypriot.
Yeah, definitely, yeah. And if it was put on Cypriot Greek, Cypriot Turkish, Cypriot Arabic, all those kind of denominations were outlawed, and English was a language. And now if you go to Turkey and Greece, their English is terrible. Yeah, if you go to Cyprus, everyone speaks very, very good English, which is why it's so appealing to a lot of Brits who go there and retire and whatever else, because you still get the sense that it has a very British presence. There's 2 British army bases still there now. And when you drive through them, it's like you're driving through the Southbank. It's weird. But, it's the idea of colonising space, of colonising, and this axiomatic hegemony, this idea that we are going to indoctrinate you with our way of doing things. And when people say to me, do you think you're overrepresented or you over-identify with Cypriotness? I say perhaps. I think perhaps there's a neuroses there. I think perhaps I'm slightly obsessed with this subject. However, I think it comes from somewhere, and it comes from the fact that the progenitors of cultural obsession, the obsession with the self, were the British. They went around the world. 23% of the country by the late 20th century was dominated by a little island in the Northern Hemisphere. And it was all an ideological mission to civilize, thrust this way of living, and extrapolate all the resources that we could in order to suit political and economical gain. We understand that. So this is an inheritance. I've inherited a neuroses that obviously the British had. And if we go back to where did that come from, that probably came from being this little island, being invaded by so many other people, and thinking the invention of the gun, mid-14th century, them taking that technology and using it against the Irish, the Scottish and the Welsh, and slowly using the Marine Corps, the Maritime Division, things like this, taxes, putting them in. There was a whole load of things that happened from the invention of the gun all the way through to the transatlantic slave trade, industrial revolution, and the height of empire, to where we are now. And I think all of those things coupled are what I think with that book I'm trying to kind of perhaps I'm trying to take on too much, but
I love that you spoke about those things, because I would love you to read Now My Ego Wants Better Things. And there's that one line in it which, like the narcissism of a bullet, touches on those beautifully.
Now my ego wants better things. Evenings shoulder into the jasmine, fouler than a fatted cock. Each peony born to its station grows towards similar heights. We write so well for our kind, license the lexicon of power like the narcissism of a bullet. Stand by for a pylon in snow. History's digital cachet dilates. News gets crowned our century's insomniac. You're struggling to backpedal, spinning around the flush. I'll come clean. I can't stomach these tiny screens. 10-minute videos. Someone's about to get cancelled. You know where this is heading. Some never get to come back as I'm sorry. How do you look so authentic in reproach? Breath rich in hemoglobin. Your smirk thick with lipids. You know some lives won't make it the full way. Again, bodies will be snuffed at a red light. At the bottom of your rhetoric, semantics cruel. I want to vandalise speech, repurpose each syllable with a fairer way of shaping. You sit, sharing a ready-made war, bickering over its origin. You and I know the world is the last time for some of us who want life slowed. Each hashtag comes with a perfect set of holes, a cell. No matter the protest our actions become, we'll be hauling our slang around like a state calling back its dogs, who brand wounds to sell them on. No matter the language we arrive in, no matter how long it's been since.
Thank you. There's this one author that I've been quite influenced by is Edouard Louis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I read all his books.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
And he was a student of Didier Eribon.
Yeah, that's right, yeah. All his books. I think the last one that I read was dedicated to him.
Really?
Yeah.
Was that Who Killed My Father?
Yeah.
Was that one?
Yeah.
In an interview, Edouard Louis said, and this just floored me, he was talking about transfuge de classe, like moving between classes, like leaving the working class and becoming bourgeois as an author. And the interviewer asked him, do you feel at home in your new class? And he said that I don't want to feel at home, because his aim or his project is to use his experience to encourage a political revolution through writing. And I love this idea of writing as a radical political act, and the idea that we choose to continue to be the other. I'd love to know, like, what do you think we lose when we lose our sense of otherness?
I mean, to lose something, you gain something else, right? And I think that question, the implication is assimilation. I don't think you ever lose your otherness. I think you assimilate in a way that feels kind of camouflaged. You adopt certain modes of behaviour, the way you speak, the way you dress. However, for certain individuals, they could do that and they have certain attributes like whiteness will help them assimilate a lot easier. However, for a person of colour, if you're black, if you're South Asian, or you're mixed race, mixed heritage, assimilation is different because you can't change the colour of your skin. You can't change your physiognomy. And so you might change the way you talk, the way you pronounce certain words, even your point of reference. You might be a fantastic autodidact, but you're still that person. So again, it's like this mode of assimilation, this otherness. What is being othered is what is being othered the way that you talk. And if that's the case, can you sound more posh to fit the industry that you work in? Can you be more verbose? But I think all of these things are context specific. It depends on the performance. What theatre are we in? Are we at an award ceremony? Are we at a literary prize giving? Are we at a conference? Where are we when that othering happens? Are you in a pub? And so I feel that one of the big things with me is that I like to socialise the poems. I like to make them feel that they might not be at the gym, at the pub, in the park, but they might be in a locale. Where is the locale? And what's the tension? What is at stake in this space? And I'm really interested in that. And it's much more subtle in this book. It was a lot more prominent in the last one because I wanted to complicate the idea of space and the poetics of space.
Yeah, there's so much there. It's the performativity of identity and how you present. That's really interesting. And how that connects to place, like even thinking about like psychogeography is super interesting to me. It's like what hidden trauma lies within this space. Being a mixed race person with immigrant parents speaking multiple languages, and I've never associated myself as being wholly British ever since I was like I was bullied in primary school for the way I sounded because I had an American accent.
And you assimilated through, I guess it's survival, right? Yeah,
going to these places, so like going to the Royal Courts of Justice and being in the courtroom, and there are so many rules in the way that you speak. It sometimes feels like I'm not even physically in the room looking at it from a bird's eye view. but I enjoy the ability to inhabit the space and to pull it apart and critique that.
And also problematizing the space. When someone who is mixed heritage or is mixed race or presents as one thing but is actually something else, so on and so forth, you problematize the space and the people in that, which I think is, again, one of the functions of art, is to offer that problem, is to give it and let the reader, again, not problem solve, but sit with the problem, which I think is really quite important.
Let them feel the discomfort.
Let them feel that, art should be discomforting. Art is not supposed to be like joyous and celebratory. Yeah, sure, there's aspects of art that can be that when that's its focus, but as a whole, it should be unsettling.
When we're so often told to assimilate and to adopt the behaviours or beliefs of the majority, to be able to assert your own understanding of yourself and your belonging, to make the other person feel discomfort, is quite empowering.
For sure. I think assimilation is accommodating others, and it's usually the dominant group that are being accommodated. And I think for me, part of assimilation is self-editing, and I don't edit myself anywhere I go. And that's not me trying to be a kind of renegade. It's the fact that I don't think there's anything particularly wrong with the way that I talk or how I dress or how I look. And if someone says to me, oh, you're a bit uncouth, which they've told me before, I am a bit uncouth. Like I can chat properly, but then I can be very casual and I can use vernacular, and I'm just a regular person like everyone else is. And I don't have the filter. And if I want to be crude and I want to swear, I'll do it. And it's not arrogance, but it's the fact that my identity and my class background, I've had to fight to be here. So I'm not going to capitulate because somebody else sees my mode of interaction as being uncouth, or it ruffles something within them. I think that's for you to go and work out, my friend. Like, I'm going to carry on being my good self. So
I've already done my therapy journey.
I've done my bit.
Yours.
Yeah, go for it. I'll give you a number. I know a great person. Yeah.
I love that. Touching on therapy and healing, which are themes in heritage aesthetics, and how that therapy journey is a space for exploration about what it means to be a father and to parent. What has helped you to feel more rooted or grounded?
So I had therapy for 2 years, and I think my next thing is going to be rooted in therapy. I found it a very interesting dynamic, the idea of a therapy session. And this was with the same guy over 2 years. I don't know if I did ever feel rooted, but I think what I wanted to try and do was reflect somehow the way that a therapy session goes in a poem. And I'm super discursive. When I get uncomfortable, I just move away. My mind is very restless, and I wanted to try and map the discomfort of a therapy session, also the banality of a therapy session, because sometimes you go there and I've got nothing to say to that. I'm actually all right. I feel fine. And you make a problem. I remember thinking, like, I've got to make something out of nothing. Like, I don't. And then the language we use around therapy, which I hear so many people now, it's become kind of like the parlance of the day, is to use like triggered and hold space and all these terms and phrases that have come out of the psychotherapy profession, and people just using them now. But again, I think what's happened is we live in a very hyper-individualist, hyper-capitalist state. We have lost the ability to care for each other. And we're now seeing, again, our lives are so mediated by the online world that we are trying to renegotiate systems of care in a very technologically advanced period. And we don't really know how to look after each other. So I think the therapy speakers could come in as a way of kind of giving us a framework or a language to communicate when someone is feeling upset or threatened or triggered or whatever it might be. The fatherhood thing, the therapy, the grounding, it's working stuff out. And what I really liked about therapy is it's not solution-based. And I was like, so is poetry. My poetry isn't solution-based. That's where I kind of made the first two spark plugs meet each other. And I was like, I'm going to try and move in these poems in the way that I do in a therapy session. And 50 minutes feels like a unit of poetry. So I'm going to try and map it and see what happens. And that's how this one kind of began. It was weird and impulsive, big impulses, like intuiting the language, using impulse as a kind of driver.
You mentioned a psychology of a feeling earlier, which is, wonderful approach to take. What feelings do you find hard to explain to friends who aren't like you?
I find connection very difficult. I find connection very hard. I find certain things that I think a lot of people find quite straightforward, very difficult, such as like holding hands with someone you love, or sometimes reading the signs in a room. I get quite confused about certain things. And obviously I don't really say it because you're not, it actually sounds stupid if you were to just say it out. But I think it's like being in my friends versus me. And I think at the beginning it was, he's just eccentric or he's a bit quirky. But as you get older, you realise that you're responding to different things. And that was the difference growing up. And the thing is, you end up sounding arrogant when you try and position yourself, because it's not an above or a below thing. It's just you're in tune to a different kind of frequency. And my interests, how I relax, I just find connection very difficult. And I think through poetry, it's my way of connecting. But again, I leave the language as porous as possible, because that's the only way that I feel I can connect with someone. If I start saying to you, the British were bad, they hurt my father and they messed up my grandparents, we kind of already know that. There's no surprise or intrigue in that argument. So how do you take it further? And that is where I feel I'm connecting with people. And it's interesting because in spoken word, a lot of those poems that I wrote in 2012, 2013, 2014, I used to go and perform them. I knew them from memory. And I used to get like standing ovations and people would cry in front of me in the audience. I used to see people like really tearful. And I was like, this is it. They're moved by it. I'm connecting with them. But then I was like, I'm also think I'm manipulating them, because I wrote this for that response. I wrote this because I wanted that to happen. Whereas if you were to say to me now, what do you want to happen when someone reads one of your poems? I don't particularly know. I just want them to connect in the way that they forge connection. And that might be to be confused. That's still, I didn't get that line that you wrote. What did you mean by that? I'm like, cool, the line infected you. Like it got you, because we're here 3-4 weeks later and it kind of confounded you. And I think that's it. And there are lines that I have no idea what they mean. The world is as blue as an orange. But I think about it all the time because it's got so much possibility.
Creates a world in itself.
Yeah. And it's that's connection. You're inviting somebody in. It's not locking them out. They've locked themselves out. They lock themselves out of their own house and they're blaming the front door. That's what it is.
And that sense of connection also connects to care, and what you talked about around care earlier, that we're trying to negotiate our care with each other. And a lot of that is also tied into arguments like Sophie Lewis abolished the family, around the whole idea that we've privatised care and over-privatised it to the point that we're using therapeutic language with each other.
Everyone's a therapist now. Like everyone's a life coach. Everyone's a counsellor. Like the amount of people that I know that I do it on the side. What do you do on the side? I'm a life coach. I did a course, 3-week course, and now I'm like, this is unbelievable. So it's like, and then really, and I don't want to kind of undermine anyone who that is their profession, but when I get into talking with people who've been doing it for maybe like a year, and I say, what kind of stuff do you guys with your clients? What kind of things do you? And they're like, we just talk. I'm like, you talk? Yeah, we just talk. And they tell me how they're feeling. I think what's happened is that we've entered this hyper-professionalization where even having a conversation has now become professionalized. They're professional conversationalists. And you can be a professional dog walker because of the fact that capitalism wants everything professionalized, which is commodified and made visible and tangible. That's the problem that art has. How do you quantify the monetary value of a painting or the monetary value of a poem? It's all subjective, right? No one's paying 10 million for a poem unless it's, I don't even think, like an early Auden poem or Eliot poem, like from his notebooks. I don't know how much that goes for. But I'm interested in the commodification of art in a state of hyper-professionalization, which I think, going back to like the life coach, the counsellors, There's people that have got Instagram accounts and they're just giving life advice all day long on it. And it's all platitudes. It's stuff we've heard a million times before. But people need to hear it because, again, our culture is so devoid of any kind of spiritual nourishment, and we're all broken and we're all trying to work something out. Like, everyone is trying to fix some part of their interiority that is broken. There's not one person that I know that has got it figured out. And I think these places act as a tonic, a panacea for that discomfort that we live in. And some people's malaise is bigger than others.
Yeah, and that ties to Byung-Chul Han's work around the Burnout Society and psychopolitics, about emotional capitalism. Like, capitalism and this entrepreneurial project becomes easier if people are invested in that and believe it's the solution.
Yeah. And it's the idea of paying, the idea that you buy the self-help book. And I think a lot of this has kind of spiraled over from the early 2000s, where you saw the book world flooded with self-help books from America that were all being brought over, and everyone was a life guru. And that guy, what was his name, Tony Robbins?
Tony Robbins,
yeah. People would go and pay thousands to go and hear him proselytize and tell everyone what they need. There's a lot of charlatans in that kind of profession because it is language, like it's manipulative language, it's affirming language. And you could argue some people need to hear that. Great. But I also think, why do we keep going back to it? If these books worked, surely you just read one book and then you're fixed. But the fact is, you keep going back for another one.
Need to level up the the development.
Yeah, for sure.
One of the key themes that you explore is the family as agent of the state. And how has your exploration of the paternalistic mission of colonialism changed the way that you parent?
So I think colonialism prided itself as being a paternalistic mission. It was going over there. It infantilized the colonial subject in a way. It kind of said, I need to go and I'm going to use force, and I'm going to use aggression, and I'm going to use control. I'm going to do it all for the greater good. I do it because I love you. And that's why I'm doing it. And obviously no one bought it, but that's what they told themselves over here to keep the agenda going. And I think being a father, you enter with a template. And that template is the one you inherit. Again, we go back to inheritance and heritage from your father. And my template that I got from him I don't think it was a particularly good one, or not a healthy one. And I think I've had to make some concessions with the way in which I parent. And there's certain things I just won't do. Maybe because I am actually still in, like, to use therapy talk, an active trauma state. And there are certain things that will literally just paralyze me, that if I see in the street. If I see an adult shouting at a child, like their own kid, it disrupts my entire equilibrium. And that's something that I haven't quite resolved, and I don't know if I ever will. But even films where children are being hurt, I just have to stop watching them. Like, I can't carry on. I get really fidgety and uncomfortable, and I just leave. With my kid's 8 now. When I found out I was going to be a dad, and my partner, we spoke about it. It wasn't like an accident. It was something we were planning and trying for. I want to contextualize the world, because I asked myself, what was the one thing, aside from the madness of growing up in a house with 2 other siblings and a working mum and a working dad and pets and just noise and aunties and uncles and grandparents, what is it that you wished you had growing up? And I just wish I had context. I wish someone offered me context. Why is that guy on the floor sleeping? Come on, we've got to go. We're in a rush. Come on, leave this later. We'll talk about it later. Why has she just done that to him? How come that guy has everything and this guy has not? Context. I was inquisitive, but nobody ever put the world into context for me. And I thought, whereas my son grows and he develops and his questions develop and his curiosity and his wonder develop, I want to be there to accommodate that. That's, I think, was the most important thing you could do. And there's a line in the job of any parent is to prepare their children for a world without them. And I feel that context is part of that preparation. Because if you can see the world, and obviously you make your own context as you get older, and you have your own experiences that are going to be outside of mine, that my son has. But he has a framework to move from.
Can we ever soften the world for our children when they have to grapple with their own sense of identity?
I think the world is beyond repair, and softening it. I don't know if you're just anaesthetizing yourself to try and say to soften. And maybe that's what we do with drink and with drugs, is we try to soften ourselves because we're a product of a hard, broken and unwell society. And we self-medicate through these permissible kind of substances. His experiences are going to be his identity is different to mine. He's comprised of 7 different groups. You know, his mum's mixed, I'm Cypriot, but she's mixed with a lot of things. So it's like he looks like he could be from a bag of different places as well. So he's going to have to contend with this stuff. And all I can do is be there to assist and guide.
It's ultimately his own journey.
Yeah.
The last poem I'd love you to read is Float.
Float. The chance to be part of this happens briefly. My sun grows to edge where the ocean slips, roughly pointing towards a float. He asks me to rescue it from a future he can't see. 3 slow steps in until I'm governed by cold, moving towards an unknown confluence. I'll say how I panicked, unmoored by my weight. They say the closer you get to time, the further it moves. For a brief second, I believed I could make a difference. Another cold thought splits my side. Salt clings, feels rough around my limits, each wave dumping sweat. I see my son's worry in the surge, hear his asking rumble through the earth's bladder. I want to ask for more time. How can a body reverse in water? I say aloud, I don't think I'll make it, seeing his profile plunge like a conch. As a boy, I took a brief diving course where I learnt how oxygen turns starfish rough, drying them into land until a child discovers the cold of them, chucking what's left into a bucket. Over time, our colder selves arrive to find us struggling against the drift, asking for a cup of moonlight to sunny the meadows from our rougher years. Say I persevered, not wanting him to see me fail, even if for a brief second he lost sight of me or believed I drowned at sea. I'll stay repurposing my strongest lines, see the float reaching for my hand, the gap becoming less cold, reminding me the ocean is alive inside the world. It's brief, to keep the retina saline, to not need a question, asking for little in return. The sea. It refuses to say why it keeps down the masthead, the ghost roughly the size of my son's waiting. I turn towards him roughly where I left. What's keeping me afloat? My work sees him dressing up for a life, rehearsing what I'll finally say, hill walking out the ocean, his float in hand, juddering from cold. I did it for you, I'll declare. If he ever asks where I was the whole time, then I'll keep my explanation brief, roughly the way my father did during those colder years when I begged his hand to turn me calm. I'm looking across the foreshore. I can't see him anywhere. I had this to give, to say briefly.
What does home taste, sound, smell and feel like for you?
It tastes warm, like a burnt sugar, kind of like a prune, maybe. Dark sugars is home. There's a stillness that comes with it. I think the closest thing that I ever got to home is, for me, stillness. And the person that I felt the most still with was my grandma, who died in 2018. And I spent the first 4 or 5 years of my life with her. But then she lived with us for another 15 years. And she was kind of like my best friend. Like, we used to hang out every day, go for drives. She was like in her 80s, but I'd just stick her in the car, put some music on. And she was really funny. And like, I think about her every day, but it was the only relationship I've ever had where I felt completely at peace inside my body. And for me, that is home. I think physical spaces are dangerous. They have the possibility to be very safe, but there's also the potential to be dangerous. I think people, when you're with people that invoke a sense of calm, invoke a sense of tranquility, that's a different thing. And for me, that's where home lies, being among and with certain people. Because you've got the familiar, which you could argue is what you've known the longest, how you've been socialised and conditioned. But then you have people. You could just sit in silence with someone and it'd be absolutely fine. Or you get the news that your parents have just died. Who do you go to? Like those are the questions. I mean, they're quite extreme, but I think they're important philosophically because they reveal a lot about where you feel safe and whose counsel you want to seek at times of extreme feeling and emotion.
That feeling of being safe in your body is such an important line of inquiry to feeling at home.
Yeah, for me, it's the same thing. And when we build our homes, we build them around a sense of calmness. Like we want to feel the exterior almost sets and balances our interior. I think part of the way we use interior design is to invoke that sense of calmness because that's what we want. And with certain and there's some people that I love, but I'm with them and they're so intense. I need to just go and have a bath after I've finished hanging out because my body just feels so wired. They're lovely people, but you can only be with them for like 2-3 hours and it's like, right, I've got to go now. But there's other people that I can just be with them in their company for days and days and days and you don't even notice it. And there's other people who you just feel very safe with.
Feeling at rest.
Feel at ease, at calm. It's really weird. There's nothing inside that's trying to bite you. When I'm with people, I get quite wiry. It's like barbed wire inside. And there's things like little piranhas that are trying to bite your innards. But then when you're with these certain people, it all just dissipates. And it's a really interesting thing to track and be like aware of is just how your body reacts to different energies.
And for my last question, I'd love to ask, what advice would you give to someone who finds themselves unsure of where they belong?
Well, I think uncertainty is a healthy thing. If you can learn to live with uncertainty and sit with it and not constantly need certainty, I think you set yourself up for a good life because the two biggest questions that we live with, where did I come from and where am I going to go? No one knows. And perhaps we all have a death anxiety and we create systems of certainty because although we know we're going to die, we just don't know when and how. And that, for most people, is so overwhelming. They have millions of distractions, health shots, holidays, trips abroad, life coaching, whatever you name it, to try to preserve longevity in life. I think living with uncertainty for me has been a really big positive because there are certain things that I will never know. And there were certain things that if I did know, they might impact my life in a fundamental way. And perhaps what I do know and what I don't know is all I need to know. So maybe that's just it. That's all you need to know.
That's wonderful. And if someone wants to follow you in your work, where can they find you?
I'm on Instagram and Twitter, but the conversation that I have with people is in books, really. I mean, social media is more just like pageantry and woohoo, look at me, I've won today. So I don't really take it that seriously. It's just something to do. Find the work.
In a library or in a bookshop?
In a library, in a bookshop, independent bookshops. If they haven't got them, they order. If you have to go to Uncle Jeffrey, go to Uncle Jeffrey, but he doesn't pay any tax, so leave him alone. But yeah, like everywhere the books live, I'm just having a chat with the world.
I love that. Thank you so much, Anthony.
Thanks very much.
You've been listening to Zeno. To stay up to date with our monthly episodes, you can sign up to our newsletter at zenocast.org or follow us on Instagram at @Zeno_pod. Our theme music is composed by Alex Julian Edwards.